the Center for Animals and Public Policy's second Animal Matters talk. I'm Alan Ruppberg. I'm the director of the center. It is my very distinct pleasure today to introduce Dr. Andrew Rowan. Dr. Rowan is currently the Chief Scientific Officer and Chief International Officer of the Humane Society of the United States, as well as the CEO of Humane Society International. He has a long, rich history here at Tufts. He was one of the founding faculty, taught biochemistry, was chair of the Department of what? Environmental Health? Or
Environmental Studies.
Environmental Studies. And was one of the founders and was the first director of the Center for Animals. He also founded the MS program in Animals and Public Policy in 1995. We actually have a distinguished member of that class here today, Linda Huebner, who has come down from Animals and Society Institute to visit us. Andrew, again, is a biochemist, which he's always very proud of. Did his MS and Ph.D. at Oxford in biochemistry. And again, joined the Tufts faculty very early on. He left Tufts in 1997. Yes, in 1997 to join the Humane Society of the United States. I overlapped with him for 3 years there, and then I came up here. So we have interwoven over the years. But he also founded the journal Anthrozoos, and has a long, distinguished career. Was first interested or most involved with animal research issues, and since joining HSI has become more and more involved in some of the more global animal issues. And so anyway, Dr. Rowan, I'm thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alan, and welcome to all of those who managed to get onto the WebEx program, and especially Arnie Arluk, if he made it. Arnie was one of the initial faculty at the center as well, and so and has been a long-time colleague of mine over many years, taught me all I know about ethnography, which is not an insult, Arnie. So I'd like to talk today about global street dog issues. It's something that HSI has been engaged in for since about 2000. We started in 1999, 2000 to started looking at the street dog issue, and it was in the Bahamas, which is currently being threatened by Irma, to do a small sterilization project on the island of Abaco in a community of Marsh Harbor. About 450 dogs, community about 3,000 people. And over the course of a year, we ran 3 sterilization clinics and sterilized about 400 of the what were known as potcakes, the street dogs of Bahamas. And we did a pre and post survey, something that we've done consistently. Whenever we've done projects, we've tried to get some sort of assessment of how many animals we did and what sort of outcomes there were. And so the survey indicated that the people in Marsh Harbor felt that the dogs were friendlier and healthier, and that they were sort of more amenable to the dogs on Marsh Harbor. So that was the first insight that we had, that there was some connection between sterilization programs and human behavior. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but over the years, it's become more and more important in my mind. So to move on to, let's see, we do not seem to be moving. There we go. So this is just the title slide. So I want to talk a little bit, a couple of slides briefly about the US situation. So in 1970-71, there were about 35 million dogs, owned pet dogs in the United States. And there were about 7 million being euthanized in shelters at the time. So about 20% of the owned dog population was being euthanized every year in shelters at the time. And a few years, about 20 years ago, Gary Petronek, who is a former member of the center, and I developed a model. It was really Gary's model. And we looked at the various, let's see, there should be, let me put the whole thing up here so that we've got all of the imaging. So that to look at the flow of dogs through various systems in the United States. And today there are about 72 million dogs. Some people will tell you there are 80 million. American Pet Products Association has the higher number. I think the 72 million is already too high. It may be closer to 60 million, but nonetheless we'll use 72 million as the actual number. And so you sort of see these flows. So every year about 8 million dogs are euthanized or die somewhere or other. The 6.5 million and the 1.5 million on the right-hand side of the slide. And then we need about 9 million puppies every year to maintain and grow the dog population by 1 million dogs a year, which is approximately how fast it is growing. The shelter dog population is about 5 million, 4.7 give or take. And that euthanasia number, 1.5 million, that's a 2011 figure. It's now 750,000. So the euthanasia of dogs in shelters has come down dramatically. The right-hand graph shows dogs and cats, and it's standardized to dogs and cats per 1,000 people. So it shows you the decline in the number of dogs and cats, and then the left-hand graph shows the number of dogs adopted, euthanized, transferred out, and returned to owners. And that data comes from the PetPoint system. And PetPoint basically sort of identifies about 1,000 entities that their software helps manage. And they agglomerate all of the data into one, and I multiply it by 5. So this is standardized to 1,000 entities. Multiplied by 5, there are about 5,000 animal rescues and shelters of any significant size in the country. And so it came out, I'm really pleased to say that another group at Mississippi State did a survey, and they came out with 700,000 dogs euthanized in shelters. So 750, 700,000, pretty good agreement given all the uncertainties in the data sets. So this is what's happening. So what drove that decline in euthanasia from 63, 65 down to 5 or 6 in the United States? Nobody really knows. My argument is that it was sterilization. And so when you look at the percentage of dogs that were sterilized in Los Angeles in 1971, it was about 10%. The number today is about 85 to 90%. Actually, if you look at licensed dogs, it's 98%. So there's been a huge shift in that. And what you saw in the 80s or the 1970s was a big decline in intake into shelters in California, but also here in Massachusetts, in Florida, and other places. Sometimes the decline was a little later, but you saw this very big decline in intake associated with this big rise. So the number of dogs, licensed dogs sterilized in Los Angeles jumped from 10% in 1970 to 55% by about 1976. And when you do back of the envelope calculations, 90% of those sterilizations had to have been done by private veterinary practices. So what really happened in the United States was that at 1970, the veterinary world felt that sterilization was an unwarranted mutilation of a dog or a cat. And so it didn't happen. Then Los Angeles Department of Animal Regulation Studies opened a spay-neuter clinic, municipal spay-neuter clinic, and the local veterinary community got all exercised. If you're interested in the debate, you can go to Modern Veterinary Practice in 1971, a number of articles about it at the time. And the veterinarians started sterilizing the animals coming into their practices. And that's what drove 90% of the sterilizations that occurred in Los Angeles from 1970 to 1975-6 were done by private practices. Only the municipal clinic did about 10,000 a year. So it was only a small proportion of the total number of sterilizations. And so what you're seeing here is a change in veterinary behavior. And what happened around in the 80s and late 80s was that veterinary practices stopped requiring you to opt in to sterilization. If you brought a puppy or a kitten into the practice, they started requiring you to opt out. So we see, through the 80s, the intake into shelters was relatively stable. It didn't change much. And then it began to decline again in the 90s. And then TNR for outdoor cats started to catch on in the mid-90s. And you see the cat numbers coming into shelters beginning to decline as well. So it's really the sterilization issue. But the United States has all this infrastructure. You've got 90,000 veterinarians, 20,000 practices. I mean, you've got the infrastructure to do this sort of thing. Can we do this globally? So that's the issue that I want to talk about for the rest of the talk. There are an estimated 700 million dogs across the globe. And people might think that most of them are street dogs, but in fact, only 300 million or thereabouts, plus or minus 20%, are street dogs. So what we're talking about here is sterilizing 300 million dogs. Actually, it's not 300 million, because of that 300 million, about 40%, 45% are female. So you're really talking about sterilizing about 140 million females. And so that's the task in front of us. Street dog welfare. Street dogs suffer from a number of different problems. Transmissible venereal tumors are a big issue. Some of these things are just horrendous. Food is a challenge for some dogs, although it appears that most dogs are in fact being fed by somebody in the community. And food is probably not an issue for most of the dogs. And the methods of municipal control, when municipalities and communities decide they need to control dogs because somebody's been badly bitten or killed by a group of dogs, usually they go out and beat them to death or poison them or something of that nature. So street dog welfare is a problem. There are all sorts of human health issues associated with that as well. The catchphrase these days is One Health. It's been around since for two millennia, One Health. But it's now back in popular demand. And so you've got all of these various issues about living with dogs. And if you look at the major diseases in terms of dailies, that's the disability adjusted life year measure that the World Health Organization uses to measure the impact of disease. You can see filariasis is the major one, leishmaniasis, bilharzia, tryptomyositis, rabies, are serious disorders in terms of the daily measure. And so there are big issues there. And rabies has a far bigger impact than its actual sort of death rate. The estimate is about 50,000 people a year die from rabies. I think it's lower than that these days because 20,000 of those are in India. But there's an issue behind rabies. There's cost. The recent cost estimate by the Global Alliance for Rabies Control is $8.6 billion per annum of managing rabies. Of that cost, about $2 billion, a little bit more than $2 billion, is actual direct cost, treatment for bites, et cetera, et cetera. So if you were to switch that $2 billion from treating people to dealing with the original problem, because 95% of rabies is from dogs, or human rabies comes from dogs, then you could start arguing that there's $2 billion or some portion of that available to manage street dogs. So the attempts to fix the problems, China has culled dogs like crazy in the 70s and 80s when there was a rabies outbreak, and they pretty much eliminated rabies in China because there were no dogs. And then in the 2010-11, rabies started creeping up, human rabies cases started creeping up in China, and they started going back to the streets to kill dogs. And at night they'd go around banging dustbin lids together, and dogs would bark, and they'd go into the house, take the dog out, and beat it to death. So it was that sort of approach, a fairly draconian approach to dealing with the dog issue. And the premier himself stepped in and stopped it. Didn't stop it everywhere because the Chinese communities or regions are fairly autonomous, but he basically sent out a note saying, stop doing this sort of stuff. He had his own pet dogs. So China has stopped doing that and has started vaccinating instead. Bali, rabies was introduced into Bali, probably by somebody bringing some meat dogs with them on a fishing boat. And the island government started killing the dogs. People didn't want their dogs killed because 95% of the dogs in the villages are quote-unquote owned, even though to you and I, they're just street dogs. And people took their dogs with them around the island and spread rabies all across the island. It was originally just in 2 provinces, but it rapidly went to the whole island, and at the height, about 85 people died in 1 year from rabies. They managed to get it under control because of a vaccine drive, but the government continues to cull vaccinated dogs, thereby removing the protection. And so rabies has now come back again. So 2016, about 12 people died. 2015, only 1. So it's an ongoing issue about how they try to do this sort of stuff. In Madras, Chennai, the municipality killed dogs from 1860 to 1994, and by 1994 they were killing 10 times as many dogs as they were killing in 1864. So not exactly a recipe for success. You know that Einstein quote, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result. Well, certainly that's what the Madras authorities did. But in 94, they stopped and started doing a spay-neuter project. So the catch and remove to shelter is another approach that communities have used. Bhutan, they did that, were appalled by what happened because the dogs were dumped into these open enclosures and started fighting and killing each other and eating the carcasses. And the Bhutanese, who are Buddhist and not in favor of not the sort of people who can tolerate animal suffering, were just appalled by what was going on. And so they called us in to help them out with that. In Bulgaria, the Sofia authorities have focused on building a shelter. Again, they've got 20,000 or 30,000 street dogs. They'll fill up the shelter. There'll still be 20,000 or 30,000 street dogs. And now they've got a full shelter. They won't euthanize the animals because most developing and developed countries are anti-euthanasia. The United States, a few European countries are the only places where euthanasia is accepted as a solution. And so you'll be left having spent money on a shelter, spending money on running it, and the dog's probably in substandard conditions. Italy has a state-supported shelter system, and they've got millions of dogs in shelters, and they're paying $4 or €4 per dog per year, or whatever the number is, to maintain them. Again, they won't euthanize. So this is not a solution. So the sterilization and vaccination is the solution. I've talked about the United States in the 1970s. It has had a huge impact, I believe. Again, it's not proven. Nobody actually did the studies to demonstrate that there was a correlation between sterilization and the drop in intake and euthanasia. But today, many organizations are arguing that surgical sterilization is too labor-intensive. So they're all waiting around, waiting for a chemical sterilization. But while we wait, we need to be doing something because it's going to be 10 or 20 years before a satisfactory chemical sterilant comes on the market. And animal birth control is already having a significant impact in India especially, but also everywhere else. Wherever you do animal birth control, you seem to be changing human behavior. Not sure why, but that seems to happen. So looking at what the challenges are, not just the 300 million globally, but looking at the numbers around the world in different parts of the world, it's really interesting that the number of dogs per 100 people varies by about 800-fold. One of the reasons for that variation is because there are fewer dogs in cities and dense urban areas than there are in rural areas. That accounts for about a 10-fold element of that variation. But 80 to 100-fold, we don't know why it happens. So you've got India up here, has 3 to 4 dogs per 100 people, whereas the Philippines has 25 to 40 dogs. If you had asked me before we started collecting some of this data, whether I would have thought that India and the Philippines were that different, I would have said absolutely not. But they are. And so the idea of sterilizing all the dogs in India is a lot simpler, maybe 36 million street dogs. You know, it requires far less resources than to do it in Philippines, where you're going to have 40 or 45 million street dogs. So it varies dramatically from one part of the world to the other. And here's some more data from different communities. So in Mauritius, we found that there were 15 owned dogs and 5 street dogs per 100 people, whereas in the state of Haryana, next to Delhi in India, there were 2 owned dogs and 8 street dogs per 100 people. So these 2 regions, require a completely different approach. In Mauritius, we need to persuade the dog owners to change their behavior. In Haryana, we can actually probably have an impact simply by going out and sterilizing as many street dogs as we can catch. And we did that in one of the districts, sterilized about 70,000 street dogs in a couple of years plus, and vaccinated about 220,000 street dogs. So we haven't gone back and done an evaluation of that, and that's what we're about to start doing. But again, the numbers vary dramatically from one part to another. So that variation, 800-fold variation, as we start looking at it, I believe it's entirely due to human behavior. Now, it's easy to identify that there are 22, 24 dogs per 100 people in the United States and 7 dogs per 100 people in Sweden. That must be due to human behavior because the dogs are all controlled. They're all pretty tightly controlled in these 2 countries. But in Philippines and India and Colombia, the dogs are all roaming around on the streets, and so you see why would human behavior have such an impact? We don't know. It's something that we're going to be looking at over the coming years. So you get these issues that people raise about sterilization. So people argue they don't want the stray dogs in the street. Now, that's not true of the entire community. You have differences of opinion within any particular community. But if a dog bites or kills a child, you're going to have the people who don't want the street dogs are going to gain the ascendancy for a while, and then everybody forgets about it, and the people who want the street dogs go back to feeding them, and the dog numbers don't really change much from year to year. Dog bite danger, sterilization. This is one of the interesting elements of data elements that we've been picking up. Sterilization appears to change the dog bite rate. Don't know why. Part of it is due to the fact that breeding creates a lot of dog aggression. And so people get in between 2 dogs that are trying to breed or trying to fight over a female in heat, they get bitten. But, and so about 30% of the dog bites in a particular community where there's no sterilization will be because of dog breeding behavior. But the other 70%, we don't know why sterilization decreases dog bites. Suspect it's due to the fact that the people and the dogs develop a more harmonious relationship. People start trusting the dogs start trusting the people, less chance of a bite. You've got dog zoonoses, sterilization. One paper, one research project found that sterilization reduced the incidence of zoonoses. Rabies, certainly, dog bites, we demonstrated in other studies. And there's this question raised, what if a dog that's been sterilized bites you? We have no known cases of anybody suing because of a sterilized dog biting. So this is one of those legal concerns that has no data to support it. And then what about the rabies vaccine? It's only effective for 3 years. In actual fact, if you vaccinate a dog, you're probably going to get protection for longer than that. And most of these dogs don't live. If they're sterilized, they actually do live longer, maybe twice as long. But even so, 6 years is old for a dog. So if you vaccinated a dog, you've probably protected that dog from rabies for most of its life. Here's some charts of the population, dog population versus human density. So these are log plots. The y-axis is a log axis. And the left-hand chart is from Haryana, where we counted dogs in 1 kilometer square boxes. And you can see it's a pretty good, the R squared is 0.45. It's reasonably strong, pretty good relationship between density. But then you come to the United States and you look at state-by-state density numbers and you see the same relationship. So this is where we sort of argue that the higher the human density, the lower number of dogs per 100 humans. And I suspect if you look at Manhattan, the number of dog bites treated in hospitals in Manhattan is about 1/4 the number treated in other areas that have a similar population, in rural areas that have similar population. And I suspect that's because there are far fewer dogs in those dense urban communities. So some examples of what we've been seeing. So in Costa Rica, there's one shelter that we've been supporting now since 1991. And they've been collecting data probably since about 2004-05. And the chart on the left shows the number of animals adopted and the number of animals euthanized in that particular shelter just outside San Jose, the capital of Costa Rica. And you can see the number of animals adopted indicates a human behavior change. The number of animals euthanized may or may not, but the number of animals adopted certainly indicates that humans are not coming to the shelter to adopt animals. If you look at, there were 2 surveys done in this area of Costa Rica around the capital, in the valley around San Jose, one in 2003 and one in 2011. And they were the same questions, same surveys that were presented. So they asked whether you have dogs aged 6 or higher, and in 2003, 17.5% had dogs aged 6 or higher, 2011, 27.6%. The data point that I find really convincing here is the number of percentage of households letting the dog sleep inside. It jumped from 26.5% to 54%. The households permitting dogs on the street without supervision from 34% to 17%. I don't really believe those numbers, but that's what people reported. You know, in America in the 80s and 90s, people would say, oh, my dog never roams. Yeah, I let him outside when I leave for work in the morning, but he stays on the property, you know. And so I suspect it's the same thing here in Costa Rica. And then the households taking dogs to veterinarian at least once a year went from 61% to 80%. So these indicate human behavior change. And what we're all after here is changing the human behavior. One of the things that I've become more and more interested in is veterinary capacity. And so if we're going to sterilize 300 million street dogs or 140 million females, we're going to have veterinarians who can do this. And in India, for example, veterinarians have almost no hands-on training. So they graduate from veterinary school with book learning, but not much else. So we can take these students and start training them to do surgery. And I don't think it would be any surprise to those of you in the room. Some people do it well, some people don't do it quite so well. And what we need is veterinary surgeons who can do sterilization of a female in 10 or 15 minutes at most, and one that's safe and effective. And so that's what we're sort of looking for. And so we hire these young veterinarians out of veterinary school, put them to work, and some of them turn out to be super surgeons. One of the people that we've been using, who's employed by us in Jaipur, is inarticulate. I'm not sure I'd take my dog to him to have the wellness exam done, but he can do a sterilization in 5 to 8 minutes. He is just superb at doing the sterilization. And so, you know, it's different skills for different purposes. And so what we're looking for is to build this up. And in India now, we've had about 200 veterinarians go through our program, and we only have about 15 or 20 of them left with us. So there are 180 that have gone through the program who can now do sterilization. In Bolivia, a few years ago, we had an American veterinarian come with us to do sterilization. And the students from the local veterinary school in Bolivia were astonished because she was doing sterilizations in 20 minutes. And they had been told by the professors at the veterinary school that sterilization was a very dangerous surgery, and indeed it was, as it was done at the veterinary school, because it took 2.5 to 3 hours to do the surgery. And so, the people, people began to realize, okay, well, let's do speed. And everybody talks about speed as important, and of course, you'll probably have the adverse outcome rate will be a U-shaped curve, or this way. As you get faster and faster, there'll be some point where you start increasing the number of adverse outcomes. We don't know what that point is. There's almost no data on veterinary outcomes, on surgery outcomes in the veterinary field. Very little. And this is something that I'm hoping to change with time. And this is a graph that comes out of a team at the Help and Suffering group in Jaipur. Jack Rees is a British veterinary surgeon. He's running the veterinary program there. And he started collecting data on length of incision and time of surgery. And typically, we try and get our veterinary surgeons to use a centimeter to 1.5 centimeters incision size, because the smaller the incision, the less chance there is of postoperative infection. And what you can see here is the smaller the incision, the faster the surgery. So probably what happens is that the longer incisions were caused because there was more complications or something of that nature. So don't have a sort of a qualitative analysis of this. But this is one of the few bits of data that actually starts addressing time, adverse outcomes, and so on. And we're now trying to collect data on individual surgeons to find out what the adverse outcomes are in each case. And we have in Jamshedpur, the first 9,500 dogs that we did, we had 3.3% had pyometra, 4.4% had mange, 3.2% had TVTs. We euthanized 5% of them preoperatively because they were in bad shape. And we had 0.59% postoperative deaths. That's relatively high for sort of a surgery in the United States. But you're dealing with relatively difficult circumstances here. And none of this is gas anesthesia. It's all injectable anesthetic. So these are the numbers that we have. And of those 0.59%, what happened was some you open them up and found there were all sorts of other things in the animal, and so they would be euthanized. So lots of issues here about veterinary medicine. And I'm really interested in how fast the average veterinary student becomes skilled at surgery, and whether it takes 10 surgeries to go from 1.5 hours to 20 minutes, whether it takes 100 surgeries to do that. Really interested in some of that data. I think it's important to understand, because what we need is veterinary surgeons who can do the surgery in 10 minutes. So in India, in Jamshedpur, which is right here in the state of Jharkhand, has 1.25 million people. And we surveyed various communities, and we found from 1 to 6.6 dogs, more dogs in the less dense communities, fewer dogs in the dense communities per 100 people. And we've sterilized 21,000 of the 25,000 dogs, street dogs, that we estimate are in that city in the first 3.75 years. We've turned that project now over to the Jamshedpur Utilities Corporation, and they said that they would continue it. We're going to go back and continue to do some monitoring every year to see whether they are. In Haryana, the government of India ponied up about $1 million to launch a sterilization and vaccination program in the state of Haryana. And in the end, we did our survey. We estimated initially that there were about 3 dogs per 100 people in the state. When we did the survey, we found there were 10 dogs per 100. So suddenly we were unable to do the whole state, which we originally thought would be about 750,000 dogs. So we ended up just doing a district. And there was all sorts of back and forth between the government. And we pulled out of the project after 2 and a bit years because the government was not paying as it should have done. It wasn't providing the services that they said they were providing. But in the meantime, we vaccinated 63,000, sterilized 63,000 dogs and vaccinated 253,000. So we're going to go back and identify a couple of villages where we vaccinated and sterilized and a couple of villages where we just vaccinated and try to do some rabies titers if we can in those villages and compare the two after 2 or 3 years to see whether or not, because one of the arguments that the rabies folk argue is saying sterilization is a waste of money. And I'm not sure that it is, because if you sterilize a dog, it lives twice as long, and it's going to be protected for twice as long, and it's going to provide protection for twice as long. It may mean that you don't have to go back and vaccinate. So the World Health Organization says you have to vaccinate 70% of the population of dogs in order to provide protection. But the reason for that is because over the course of 12 months after the vaccination, the number of dogs drops to 40% of the population because they die. And so you need 40% of the population protected in order to protect against rabies. So if you sterilize and vaccinate, you may only need to do 50% of the dogs in order to maintain that 40% number. So these are sorts of questions that I have and that we're trying to answer at the moment. In Jamshedpur, that shows the number of sterilizations we did every month. And we had a team that was out there handling the dogs. That was an important part of our outreach to, again, change human behavior, because it's a change in human behavior that's really key in all of this stuff. And then you see that because our team is handling the dogs, the local people start handling the dogs. Maybe not as gently and humanely as our team, but nonetheless, they're beginning to work on it. And then, you know, you start seeing this happening. And so this is what we think is happening with these sterilization programs, that by going out and actively doing this on-the-ground project, the people start treating the dogs differently, and that's why we think that the dog bite numbers tend to drop. So you see these human behavior changes that seem to be associated with sterilization. In Costa Rica, I've mentioned that already. On Koh Tao Island in Thailand, the percentage of dogs that people claimed they owned went from 40% to 80%, or the percentage of households who claimed they owned dogs went from 40% to 80% after the sterilization program. Dog bite rates decline. I'll show a graph of that. And in a South African township where they sterilized 1,000 dogs, before the sterilization project, only about 10-15% of the dogs actually had water. This is in the Cape. It's dry. It's hot. The dogs need water. After the sterilization project, about 80% of the dogs had access to water. So there was this change, again, in the human behavior in that community. And this is the thing that I've been very excited about, is that in Jaipur, they've been doing the sterilization program since 1994. We've been sterilizing about 2,500 dogs every year since 1994. And there probably were 25,000, 30,000 dogs when they started. And the number of dog bites treated in the hospital has dropped from over 700 per 100,000 people to under 200 per 100,000 people from 1994 to 2011. That's a huge change. And again, I think that that's caused one reason why is that human behavior has changed, and the dogs are now the human-dog relationship is much more harmonious, much more friendly. So if you look at the global project again, and so you look at India, approximately 30 million street dogs. Actually, it's maybe as many as 40 million. 15 million females, maybe 2 to 4 million are already sterilized. So if you spent 50 million a year for 5 years, it costs about $20 a dog for a sterilization. So 50 million a year would sterilize 2.5 million dogs a year. And at the end of 5 years, you might be getting close to the 40, 50, 60% mark, and you'd get a change in the human behavior. So more of the dogs would be controlled, fewer of the dogs would be on the street. In Jaipur, the number of dogs on the street has dropped by 50%, coincident with the decline in dog bites. And then you start looking at what India is spending, about $1 billion a year, annual expenditure by 35 of India's largest cities on public health, 50 to 100 million annual expenditure on dog bites and post-exposure rabies treatment in animals. And the Indian government has just provided $5 million to sterilize, for a 3-year program to sterilize 500,000 dogs. It ended up only being $1 million, and we only sterilized 60,000 dogs, but it's the beginning. The government's now talking about a major program across the country. And the state of Kerala had decided to stop dog culls, but then a dog killed somebody and they've restarted it again. But there are very few street dogs in Kerala, probably because they've been culling them systematically for the past 20 years. So strategies for the Global Street Dog Project is to emphasize, illustrate the key importance of dog population studies and tracking, identify the proper approach required for different dog populations, so deal with Mauritius differently from Haryana, build the sterilization vaccination capacity, more vets who can do this work in different parts of the world, conduct the programs, and change local dog care culture that we see, for example, happening in Costa Rica, and then develop and demonstrate the outcomes. So it's a fairly simple formula, and we've been doing it since 2000, but in sort of really fairly intensive ways since 2010. The Philippine government, the Department of Agriculture has now teamed up with us we're going to do the surveys, they're going to do the vaccination. Sri Lanka wants us to do the same thing for them. Bhutan is now, we're going back into Bhutan. Bangladesh wants us to do that in Bangladesh. India is beginning to change its approach. We're vaccinating and sterilizing dogs in Puerto Rico. Costa Rica, we see the change there. Huge changes happening. So thank you very much. So I know that you have to dash off, but happy to answer questions. Yes?
Were you primarily focusing on sterilizing females, or was it pretty much equal, male to female?
When we go out and catch street dogs and sterilize them, we do both. But in Jaipur, the help and suffering team started off just doing females, and they got to 70-75% of the females sterilized within about 10 years, and then they've been doing both females and males. And they've never really got higher than about 70% sterilization rates. There are pockets of dogs on dump sites in the city that the dog catching teams won't go into because they're full of all sorts of nasty stuff. So the dogs have these little sanctuaries in the city.
Do you find that the people that potentially own or do not own the dogs are open to having the dogs sterilized?
In India, we've had people will start saying, "What are you doing with my dog?" And we say we're going to take it away and sterilize it. And generally speaking, not a lot of negative reaction, especially as in Jamshedpur, we bring the dogs back. We talk to the community before we started to do it, and people were much more engaged. So in Mauritius, we're going to talk to the community in Mauritius because we need to get more of the owners bringing their dogs to us. So in Central and South America, it's more, rather than going out and catching and removing dogs from the street, it's more about people bringing the dogs to you and beginning to change that human behavior. Because in 2 communities in South Africa and 2 communities in Bali, there's a Ph.D. project that looked at those 4 communities, and 95% of the dogs were owned. And of the dogs that weren't owned, they were generally in horrible condition. So they had to have some human support in order to do reasonably well. Yes?
I may have missed a step here, but you talked about how the amount of culling in East Asia was decreasing. Then you mentioned that they were rejecting, or there was culling in East Asia, but they were rejecting euthanasia. What is the difference between those two?
Good question. Culling tends to be more brutal than the euthanasia. But there's this general attitude. I mean, whole South America is anti-euthanasia. Italy is anti-euthanasia. So the Catholic communities tend to be anti-euthanasia. It's a blanket generalization, but that tends to be the situation. And euthanasia is a huge issue for many people. Turkey You've got about 1.5 dogs per 100 people in Turkey, and yet the Turkish communities are totally against euthanasia. So they want you to collect the dogs, put them in a shelter, remove them from the streets, but they don't want you to euthanize them. So it's the municipalities are the ones who tend to do the killing and the culling, and the people out there who are feeding the dogs are the ones who tend to want to stop you from euthanizing. And certainly the dog advocates are against that approach. Yes?
The authorities in Iran, which is where I'm involved with, are beginning to move from culling to holding the dogs and removing them, or just holding them in a space and moving towards euthanasia. And one of the arguments that they make, they had a lot of arguments against releasing them after sterilization, but one of the most, I guess, important ones in their mind is that the dogs are involved with spreading parvo and stuff to the wildlife, to the panther, to the cheetahs, and they're in danger. So that's a big deal for them. What is the going to be the right response to that?
Well, I mean, when you start actually looking at what the street dogs are doing, they hang around people. So there was an interesting study done in southern Chile that looked at the dog population. They collared 100 dogs, videotaped them, but they could track these 100 dogs. And the average daily space used by those 100 dogs was about 4 hectares, so relatively small. But there was one dog that did 5,000 hectares and a second that did 2,000 hectares. If you looked at them during the day, they were the laziest dogs in the group because all they did was sleep. But at night, they were off roaming through the farmlands. And so if those 2 dogs were controlled, you really wouldn't have a problem with dogs. So I suspect that there's this general sort of argument, and it's done with cats as well, general argument we've got to control the dogs because they're threatening wildlife and things like that, and they are. I mean, certainly the distemper in East Africa is an issue for the carnivores there. But we can, I think, manage them far more effectively if we understand more about what's actually happening and not listen to, if you forgive the phrase, the dogma that everybody promotes. I mean, most of the stuff is nonsense, frankly. But Iran is going out and culling dogs, so there's this fight now between the people who want dogs as pets and the people who don't. And there's this general attitude that a Muslim culture is anti-dog. There's an interesting book out about animals in Ottoman Egypt by Alan McHale, and he argued that up until about 1800, dogs were tolerated, indeed welcome, in Cairo because they provided protection and removed the waste. And then after that, they became dirty and problematic, and so that's when people started to change their attitude towards dogs. So I'm not sure where we're going on this.
Okay, I think we have to wrap it up. So let's thank our speaker one more time.